day and welcome to the UBS Energy Transition Call with IPS Solar. My name is Julie and I'm your event manager. During today's presentation, your lines will remain on listen only. If you need assistance at any time, please key *0 on your telephone and an operator will be happy to assist you. I would like to advise all parties this conference is being recorded. And now I'd like to hand over to Jon Windham. Please proceed.
Thanks, Julie, and welcome everybody to our latest installment of the UBS Energy Transition Call Series. So in this call series, we continue to try to connect UBS institutional investor clients with energy experts and innovative companies that are enabling or driving the energy transition. Today, we'll be talking solar development, particularly community solar development with Impact Power Solutions, or IPS. IPS is a full-service clean energy development company with an extensive track record developing rooftop and community solar projects in the U.S. So very happy to have with us today from IPS, Eric Pasi, who's the Chief Development Officer and the author of a recent book, Clean Wave, A Guide to Success in the Green Recovery, a book that is on my nightstand as we speak. I was talking with Eric, I'm about halfway through. It's a really interesting book, more from sort of a perspective of people building their careers in the industry. Some sort of basic fundamentals of the industry. Shares Eric's story. It's also got some interesting interviews with some leading figures in the industry. So as you're interested in clean energy, do take a look. Clean Wave. It's available on Amazon. That's where I got it. Anyways, this is Jon Windham. I run alternative energy and environmental services here at UBS. I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Before I hand it over to Eric for some opening comments, just a few sort of logistics. The format of today's call will be a conversation between me and Eric. We will open up to Q&A about a half hour in, maybe a little bit longer. Julie, who's the operator, will provide instructions on logging any questions after the presentation. And as always, if you prefer, do feel free to email me questions if you'd like me to ask them. I'll ask them for you anonymously as time permits. I'm sure most of you have it if you found your way to this call, but my email address is Jon.Windham, WINDHAM, @UBS.com. And then lastly, as a UBS research analyst, we are required to provide certain disclosures for all calls. The disclosures were included in the invite to this email. The short of it is this call is not a recommendation by UBS to transact in any security. A full list of disclosures is available on UBS.com. All right. With that, Eric, really appreciate you taking some time out of your day today to speak with UBS and UBS investor clients. I'll turn the floor over to you, but much appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much, Jon, and greetings. My name is Eric Pasi. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Impact Power Solutions, also known as IPS Solar. And as Jon mentioned, I'm the author of a recent book called Clean Wave, A Guide to Success in the Green Economy. I'm thrilled to join you all today to talk about the rise of community solar in the U.S. and trends for corporate procurement. I'll start today with an introduction to myself and Impact Power Solutions, then provide some context about what community solar is and where it's going, and intersperse a few stories from our company's experience in the space, and then I'll wrap up with Jon and some Q&A. Impact Power Solutions is a full-service clean energy development company. For over 30 years, we have worked to deliver customer solutions ranging from rooftop installations to multi-megawatt community solar gardens. And our company's purpose is and always has been to positively impact people, power, and the planet with solar energy. The company was founded by Ralph Jacobson in 1991, and through 2010 primarily focused on residential and small commercial installations. And in the past decade, we've shifted to become the Midwest commercial solar leader and one of the largest community solar developers in the country, according to the most recent rankings by Solar Power World magazine in 2020. We provide two options for our clients: traditional on-site solar, which could be on the roof or on land adjacent to their facilities, and community solar. Beyond our work with mostly corporations and public entities, we specialize in workforce development and equity projects, including solar for the Black community in Minneapolis near our headquarters, and work in indigenous communities like our groundbreaking projects with Red Lake Nation in northern Minnesota. A little bit about me. I joined IPS in 2007, straight out of college. At that time, I was extremely passionate about the climate issue and clean energy. And I recognize that solar was on a 40% year-over-year growth curve, which amazingly has continued to this day. In 2016, I took on the Chief Development Officer role at IPS and have contributed to growing annual revenues by more than 1,000%, arriving today near 200 megawatts of developed and constructed projects, which is enough to power roughly 40,000 U.S. homes. In 2019, we were partially acquired by Smart Pitch Ventures, which is led by a group of former utility executives based in the D.C. area. And this has fueled additional growth for our company as we strive to hit 1 gigawatt of distributed solar by 2025. As mentioned at the top, I'm also the author of a recently released book, Clean Wave, A Guide to Success in the Green Recovery, which guides readers through the past, present, and future of clean tech while offering actionable solutions for job seekers. And more info can be found at cleanwavebook.com. So now I'd like to get into the heart of today's discussion, which centers around community solar, and give a little bit of background and perspective. Most people have known about solar for decades. In the 20th century, technology traditionally powered things like remote pumping equipment, the space station, and other off-grid solutions. Grid tied really got its start in the 80s and 90s as illicit cannabis users, or growers, I should say, in Northern California attempted to reduce their electricity consumption and avoid detection from law enforcement. And that hippie mentality really powered the industry for decades as a niche technology. And our primary clients were typically people with expendable income and ideals, until the most recent decade where solar electricity has exploded in growth. Solar is now the leading new energy source in the world, where costs dropped by a factor of 5 in the past decade. It took 50 years for solar to reach 1% market penetration and only 5 years to double it. One of the fastest growing segments in solar recently has been community solar. For years, the only option for most residents and organizations wanting to adopt solar was to physically install equipment on their property. Early last decade, a few states, including Colorado, adopted the nation's first community solar programs, effectively allowing ratepayers to subscribe to solar panels that were not located on their home or building. Those early programs allowed for third-party developers like IPS to build businesses around identifying and acquiring land, securing interconnection rights, and finding subscribers to make these projects a reality. The typical model centers around an off-site solar project that produces bill credits through an agreement with the utility. The community solar garden operator markets subscriptions to the garden to residents and other organizations who want to save money, usually with no initial capital investment. So it's a pay-as-you-go or solar-as-a-service option. And the subscriber pays the solar operator monthly and earns a net savings, usually around 10%. And the operator is responsible for ongoing maintenance and subscriber management. And the utility retains the environmental attributes to meet their renewable energy goals. Community solar has several advantages that have been plagued by compared to on-site solar projects. First, it's fungible. A subscriber can transfer their subscription to another party. If there's a default by the subscriber, a crew doesn't need to show up at their home and tear off panels. The project owner can simply transfer the subscription to another party or another person. And this has significantly improved the underwriting process for these assets. Secondly, and most obviously, the cost to install the equipment at this scale is more competitive than installing on-site solar. Third, policy folks and advocates love the ability to provide clean energy access for disadvantaged communities and those typically unable to install panels on their homes or businesses. And fourth, the tax revenue, land lease payments, and other societal benefits, including pollinator-friendly habitat, agrivoltaics, reducing pesticides and soil erosion, all accrue to rural communities who need these benefits the most. As mentioned, community solar is booming across the country. While early growth for community solar installations was led primarily by 3 key markets, New York, Minnesota, and Massachusetts, a growing list of states with community solar programs have helped to diversify the market. There are currently more than 20 states with active programs and significant legislation pending in a handful of larger states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. This is all setting the stage for a record year in 2021, with anticipated total capacity reaching 3.5 gigawatts, and this represents nearly $10 billion in deployed capital. and now we're on pace for at least $2.5 billion this year alone. Minnesota Community Solar is how our company really started to take off. It's the largest program in the country. In 2013, the state legislature passed the Solar Jobs Act, and just this last month, we hit a record of 800 megawatts of operational capacity, which is about half of the state's total capacity, and it makes it the largest community solar program in the nation, 25% of the total market. These projects produce enough solar to supply energy to 195,000 homes, according to the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And data from Xcel Energy shows that the bill credits for all customers totaled more than $2 million in February of 2018, and that number is only growing. IPS was one of the original developers in that program, which is now obviously the most largest and the most successful in the country, and we were lucky to be a local company building on decades worth of relationships with similar stories emerging across the country. And one example of this centers around a small cheese and bison rancher named Ed Eichten. Ed and his family own a cheese manufacturing facility in Chisago County, Minnesota, just northeast of the Twin Cities. In 2011, our company installed 140 panels to power their facility, and I personally pulled together the interconnection agreements, the grant paperwork, and helped his banker underwrite the $200,000 loan. And that project was a success and led to a really easy conversation just a few years later when I outlined a concept of leasing an entire 40-acre hayfield for community solar. I had no idea what I was doing at the time. The company had never done a project of that size. But most of those early days were about faking it until we made it. And we formally announced the county's first community solar project in June 2014. It wasn't necessarily going to be the first, and we weren't necessarily sure it was going to happen, but that didn't stop us from being bold. And the development process included utility applications, local permitting, financing, and a lot more, all of which helped. It was similar to what we'd done a few years earlier, but at a much larger scale, 125 times larger. That fall, applications were finalized and financing fell in place, and it was really strange to see how everything lined up to become viable. And nearly 2 years from the day we announced construction began, and our company was off to the races. That project provides solar bill credits virtually to the local school district, an elder care facility in the area, also the cheese manufacturing plant, and a wastewater facility in a neighboring county. And the Eichten's Community Solar Garden has about 20,000 solar panels providing subscribers with nearly $1 million in annual bill credits and offsetting 2 million pounds of CO2 per year. As of this year, our community solar projects in aggregate are producing about 40 times as much impact. So I'll pause there as just a snapshot into the community solar market, both locally here in Minnesota, but also nationally. Since that time, IPS has expanded into new markets like Illinois, Virginia, and New Mexico, and are excited to see the growth of the industry over the next 10 years. Thanks, John.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Eric. Julie, why don't you go ahead and provide instructions on how participants can log any questions, and then I will get the conversation started.
Of course. If you do wish to ask a question, please key *1 on your telephone. That's star, then 1 on your telephone to ask a question. Perfect.
So Eric, really appreciate your sort of comments, the opening up. I just want to dive in a little bit more because community solar, in particular, is probably less focused on oftentimes by institutional investors, sort of in between the large market cap listed names are either residential or module manufacturers like First Solar, which does much more sort of utility scale. So obviously one of the interesting things about solar is it's so modular, right? You can go down to, you technically have a system that was one module, 360 something watts, or we're building, large farms that are 400 megawatts in Texas right now. Can you just talk a little bit about, what I know there's no typical system in the sense that they can change the size, but what's sort of the average size for these systems? How much land area do they take up? Just sort of the basics like that for community solar for people on the call. Thanks.
Yeah, so community solar sits in a space that's obviously much smaller than utility scale. When we think of utility scale, it's now often thousands of acres of solar panels. Community solar is typically much smaller because it interacts with the grid on the distribution level, on the distribution network. And so we're looking at projects that are anywhere from, say, 5 acres to 40 acres. And this makes community solar much more palatable, from a permitting perspective with local counties and jurisdictions compared to taking up, large swaths of land. We do run into similar situations with, the use of prime farmland and other issues, land use issues, but it's often much easier for these projects to get done. And so we're not talking about millions of panels. I mentioned the Eichtings community solar project was about 20,000 panels and 40 acres, and that's typically the size of the projects that we see. Now, it's difficult on the investment side to underwrite and execute on one project, and so what we're typically seeing in the market is a pooling of portfolios of projects that then reach a certain threshold where capital can come in and efficiently support these assets.
Got it. Thank you. And for these ground-mounted systems, one of the big trends in utility scale has been to move from fixed tilt to single-access trackers. On these sort of smaller scale systems, do you tend to use trackers, or is it mostly fixed mount? Just curious.
Yeah. So there's actually a double benefit with trackers now. So when we started on these projects in kind of the mid 2010s, all projects were fixed, and that was because of the kind of leading thought of these systems having longer lifespans, especially in northern climates like the Northeast and the Midwest, having to deal with the constant warming and cooling of the climate on an annual basis, just wreaking havoc on moving parts. And so we wanted to keep things simple. But what we found actually is that the tracking systems help to shed snow in the winter, and obviously in places like the Northeast and Minnesota with significant snow accumulation, that's extremely important. So it boosts the performance of the systems, not just from tracking the sun on during each day, but also with the ability to shed the snow. And the operations and maintenance costs for trackers has become much more of a known quantity after having installed thousands of megawatts at this point in climates like ours. The other technology that we're seeing that's very akin and also happening in utility scale projects is bifacial solar panels, and then the trend towards larger solar panels. And so when I started, the largest panel that we could get back in 2007 was about 200 watts. Now we're using or trending towards 500 to 600 watt panels. Granted, these are larger panels and require 2 people to install them, but we're starting to see that that's the most efficient way to install the equipment. And so there are many parallels between utility scale and community scale solar projects in terms of the design and installation processes.
Got it. Thanks, Eric. And maybe you mentioned a few sort of examples of customers. I'm in Massachusetts, another place that's very supportive of community solar. We have town has a 0.5 megawatt facility on top of a legacy landfill that's been closed. The high school has a large system on top of its roof. When you think about for either the market or IPS, what sort of composition of the end customer? How much is sort of public and municipal governments compared to corporations? Just sort of talk through a little bit of the end customer?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it really depends on market to market. In Minnesota, 87% of the load for the entire program is served by commercial customers. And that is atypical compared to across the nation. In a market like Illinois, there are incentives to have a larger composition of residential subscribers, so it's not uncommon in that state to see 75% or more of the garden providing subscriptions to residents. And you also see in newer markets this trend toward providing low to moderate income subscribers access to these projects. And so in Virginia, for instance, it's a requirement essentially to have 30% of a particular community solar project providing subscriptions to low and moderate income subscribers. For IPS, we've in Minnesota, because it's been a more commercially dominated market, our clients are typically have typically been school districts and municipalities. And so one of the kind of secondary benefits that we've offered to our clients is curriculum development and continuing education credits for educators to come in and learn about how to bring these 21st century learning opportunities into the classroom. Some of our other clients have been corporates that are looking for ways to help to address ESG opportunities. And so those might be folks like Hormel or Cargill or other larger corporations. And so it depends on market to market in terms of what the program requires, but we are seeing an increased interest for the program managers and the programs themselves to require more and more residential subscriptions.
Got it. And I think you said this before, but just sort of in general, is it multiple off-takers for one community scale project, or multiple customers where you're pulling together, more than one, say, school district and a corporation, and you sort of get everyone, together, and then they sponsor one project? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. So the program requirements, typically you'll need at least 5 subscribers in one garden. And so in most of our gardens we'll have 7, and that's to reduce the risk in case one defaults or is unable to participate in the garden. We can still meet the minimum requirements. But in most states there's kind of a minimum threshold of about 5 subscribers to energize the garden or to continue operating the garden.
Great, got it. And we'll get more into this, how you sort of do the customer acquisition, if you would, on that end. But I'm just curious if we could dive a little bit more into it. I'm sorry, I know some of these questions are sort of pretty basic, but I think it's important for the audience to understand how this works, because it's a relatively new topic for a lot of people. And so I'm thinking there's sort of 3 parties, if I have it correct. There's the you as the developer of the project, and then a separate owner of the project, and then do this. So in your example, the 7 off-takers, they jointly own the project, or they're simply off-takers? And I'm just interested how the economics work for the sort of off-takers. Is it, again, it probably depends on regulatory regime by regulatory regime, but is it at wholesale rates? Are they netting that off against whatever their commercial rates are? Just how the economics work for all the different entities involved in making this happen.
Yeah, John, it's very different from market to market. There are, in Minnesota, for instance, when we started the program, off-takers were being compensated at retail rates. And so that retail rate depends on what customer class you are. So if you have residents, you qualify for a higher retail rate. If you're, a commercial client, then it's lower based on kind of industrial rates. And so we went through an entire process of identifying what the actual solar value of solar is in the state. And so that was a regulatory process with the utility where we identified, everything from transmission and distribution benefits and the energy-only costs and all these other societal benefits for renewable energy attributes, to boil down into a specific value for solar. That's what's being used in Minnesota. That's what's being used in New York, for instance. And then you get into places like deregulated markets like Illinois, where the community solar project is only offsetting transmission, or is only offsetting the energy value. And so transmission and distribution charges are not included in that. But there is there's a REC, renewable energy credit, that's associated with some of those projects. So it does get quite complex. You asked a little bit about kind of the makeup of the project. A developer can also be an owner-operator. We typically will put these to investors at commercial operation or at notice to proceed. But many developers will choose to try to keep these on balance sheet and work with a tax equity investor and others in the capital stack to get these projects across the finish line. The subscribers don't actually own anything. They just entered into kind of a long-term arrangement to purchase the bill credits at a slight discount. And I mentioned 10% kind of as a placeholder. Obviously, that changes from market to market and subscribers to subscriber. But there, typically the benefits for them are kind of in the marketing aspect and just participating in community solar, and then financially and saving about 10% on their utility costs. Got it.
Thanks for that, Eric. Very, very helpful. And then one thing I wanted to loop back to was customer acquisition, which is, obviously it's a pretty big part of the cost stack on sort of residential. I know here in Massachusetts, I get mailers quite frequently about residential customers that can join in sort of community garden solar farms. How do you go about connecting with municipalities or governments that want to do this and corporations? Is it more of sort of, they're seeking you out? How much is it you getting your name out there in sort of a marketing effort? If you just talk a little bit about how that customer acquisition works in the community scale market, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah. So I did quite a bit of customer acquisition when the program first rolled out. And so, yeah, we would go to school board meetings. We would go to city council meetings and meet with facilities managers and energy managers. And so the B2B aspect is quite a bit easier, as you could imagine, to fill out these projects. We do work with, they're known as aggregators in our industry, just specific companies that are specifically going out working with residential subscribers, and there are several models there. The prevailing one that kind of came out of the gate was advertising via social media, places like Instagram and Facebook, to people with like-minded interests that had environmental tilt. They want to protect the environment and also save money. That was really the low-hanging fruit. And then other organizations popped up that actually went door-to-door or are going door-to-door to contact residents to participate in these programs. And that's much harder lift, as you can imagine. And so the ongoing cost to service the subscriptions in these cases can often represent 5 to 10% of the income for a project. So it can be relatively significant. But when we're talking about the cost to install this equipment being much more competitive, I talked about that at the front end, and then you're getting closer to retail rates for the actual energy, there's typically room in these projects to support subscription management, subscription acquisition on behalf of the project. So there's definitely a higher cost, both in the initial cost to secure subscriptions and then also to manage the subscribers ongoing with residential versus commercial. But you often can't escape that in these markets that are requiring more residential participation.
Got it. Thanks, Eric. And maybe we'll get into here real quick before we get to the line, into some of the most focus in the market right now on some really topical issues. It's just be interesting as someone sort of out there, executing on these projects. Any comments about sort of labor availability? It's sort of been a big issue with a lot of companies, the inability to get a workforce in place. If you just talk about that a little bit, it'd be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, we've actually fared quite a bit better than other industries, as you can imagine. We often we were recognized as an essential business early on in the pandemic, so we did not have to let a lot of our labor force go. And I think that's been a challenge for some of these other industries, including hospitality and retail. But where we are feeling the squeeze in the current market conditions is in supply chains, and that's just obvious to note. That we use steel in our projects, we use semiconductors and silicon, which has been short in the kind of early quarters of this year, and so that's really where we've been seeing the issues. Also with China shutting shipping down or constraining the shipping earlier this quarter had a huge impact on delivery schedules for our solar panels. And then also, in the supply chain, we ran into, I'm not sure if you were going to bring this up yet or not, but also just forced labor issues. And so the industry itself has made huge commitments to understanding how and where forced labor was an issue with our projects, which was not, less than 5% of the solar modules in the supply chain were affected by this, but we've made tracking those types of panels kind of paramount, and making sure that no kind of U.S. projects are utilizing or sourcing panels from those areas. So as opposed to labor being the primary issue or concern, it's been materials.
Yeah, so you hit on a couple of topics there that, were the other two questions. Let's dive into those a little bit more. I mean, so steel prices are up a lot, right? I think it's 300 and something percent. At least for utility scale, I think it's around 12 cents a watt used to be the cost for tracking, but 50% of the cost of goods sold for tracking is the steel. You got all, freight, all these other things going up. How is that impacted when you're thinking about, okay, projects that are on the drawing board, maybe not committed to yet, but sort of, moving forward next year? Does it sort of cause you to, some of these projects not to pencil out or want to wait and see if sort of commodity prices normalize? Just sort of how do you manage the volatility in terms of, does it make more sense to sort of wait on normalized prices, or is it more a view in the industry that these are the prices where they are today, we can still get the economics to work for people?
Yeah, I think it's for us, it's the latter, and we need to churn through projects. We need to revenue needs to continue at the company. We can't just kind of sit and wait, and so we'll typically, as a developer, need to eat those losses in those situations. However, for larger projects like utility scale projects, I think that is having an effect to delay the construction of these projects into next year. And so we are anticipating that as an industry, kind of seeing that some of these projects are being pushed to next year. The other side to that is just, the constraint on the silicon side, which, have been all over the place. Cell phones, computers, everything's been affected by a silicon shortage. And so we are anticipating that those prices will also drop next year, and so it doesn't necessarily affect the community solar market as much as it does for these larger scale projects where margins are much thinner on the utility scale side.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. And maybe one more on, obviously Western China has been quite a bit in sort of the news. And there's sort of, I guess, kind of two views out there. And I was just kind of wondering how your customers are sort of thinking about it and how you think about it as a company. There's sort of the one idea that, well, okay, there's a supply chain in a particular part of China that we're going to be concerned about. And then what you hear some other people talk about is, well, that's an artificial line, meaning it's not a separate political entity in any sense. China's essentially run by the Communist Party. These are administrative regions. And so do we feel comfortable with this pretending like this line sort of matters, or do we kind of want to de-emphasize China in general in the supply chain? I'm just wondering, one, if your customers are focused on this, I know you are, because I just from reading the book, I think you care about, doing what's right in the right way. But is this something that's bubbling up from customers? How are they talking about it, or is it, more pushed by, IPS, and since you want to do things the correct way?
Yeah, we obviously do. We obviously do want to do the right. We want to do the right thing, and it's not necessarily, only for our clients. But I think we think about our partners and our team members, right? I mean, ethically we don't want to be working on projects that have an adverse effect, whether it's environmentally or socially, and that affects our team as well. So. From that standpoint, it's a pretty hard line in the sand. From our clients' perspective, one of our clients, for instance, is Target Corporation. We do quite a bit of on-site work with Target. This was a thing that got flagged early on, and so what we did was make a commitment, along with others in our National Solar Energy Industry Association, to say that we will not be sourcing panels from Western China. And the industry has gone so far as to implement, as I mentioned, traceability protocols, and so we can understand that where they're sourcing these panels from. But you mentioned de-emphasizing China as a source for these products, and in the previous presidential administration, there was a heavy emphasis on imposing import tariffs and other things, especially in the solar arena. And so the industry itself is dispersed from China over the last 5 years or so to doing more manufacturing in places like India, Vietnam, other Southeast Asian countries, and then also domestically, where we've seen kind of the announcement from First Solar here just a few months ago, expanding their operations in Ohio significantly. And so I think as an industry, we recognize it. As a company, we obviously recognize the importance of this issue, and then our clients are as well. And so we're kind of taking those signals and moving forward by making sure that we're on the good side of sourcing solar panels and then other material that we use in our projects.
Yeah, perfect. And yeah, I'm sure many investors noted the first solar announcement. I think was $680 million investment into 3.3 gigawatts. So yeah, it's a pretty clear commitment by First Solar that at least they see some advantages of manufacturing in the United States. Maybe with that, I have several questions that have been emailed to me from participants, so thank you for those. Do keep them coming if you have any more. Again, it's Jon, Jon.Windham, WINDHAM @ubs.com. But before I get to the emailed questions, Julie, are there any questions on the line live? Thanks.
I have one question from the line of Colleen Hollinger. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Colleen from Natural Resource Services in Minnesota. And Eric, we've seen your growth from Minnesota across the United States, and what I'm wondering is what you are seeing at the permitting level as far as changes from 2010 really to 10 years, 11 years later, and if there's anything that we can do to try to preempt a county or a township in being favorable about permitting solar in the region, and particularly what changes you've seen in the last 11 years.
Thanks for the question, Colleen, and it's great to hear your voice, by the way. We've seen quite a bit of change really in the last, I would call it even just 5 to 6 years. When these projects are being permitted, the community solar projects I mentioned, it's easier to permit one 40-acre project versus a 400 or 4,000-acre project. However, in states like Minnesota now, where we have about 800 of these things across the state, it does get, communities do feel fatigue, right? And so what we're starting to see opposition, not necessarily, somewhat unfounded opposition. And so what I mean by that are folks are just, even though the permitting processes and these jurisdictions allow for solar, they're choosing to put it up moratoriums. They're choosing to say, no more community solar projects in this area. And so we've had to go, in some cases, address, potential legal remedies to get these projects done. And that really starts to take effect the longer that these programs are in place. And so I think a few things that we would find helpful. I know in Minnesota, the property tax issue is limited to projects that are larger than 1 megawatt in scale. So I think there's a way to make sure that there's more economic benefit accruing to the counties and to the local jurisdictions in these cases, and I think that will help. We've had to go through everything of, like installing screening and trees to basically, obscure these systems from the road or from adjacent residences. And I think the solar community can do a much better job of siting and making sure that we're not imposing these projects into the community in areas that are going to be confrontational. And I think with the growth of agrovoltaics, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but some counties, are pushing back on taking out the use of prime ag land. And even though, we're helping to rejuvenate the soil by installing, and you know a lot about this, Colleen, but installing pollinator-friendly habitat that restores health to the soil. We're not using pesticides. We're not turning over the soil every year. Allowing for a dual use underneath these panels, like agrovoltaics, where we're installing low-growth crops. I think the more that things like that happen, and we're providing additional benefits beyond just revenue to the farmer to lease land, the more benefits that are accruing to the communities, the easier that process will be for us to get these projects done.
Any other questions on the line, Julie?
No more questions.
Okay, perfect. Perfect time to get into some of the emailed questions, and I'll sort of put some of these together in more of just sort of a topic that I think people are getting at too. Several people asking about storage, certainly sort of a quote-unquote hot topic in the investment community right now. Just Eric, your thoughts on the opportunities for attaching storage to solar projects? I think they're asking about both sort of commercial rooftop as well as community scale.
Yeah, it's going to be the jelly to the peanut butter, right? In the next 5 years, that we won't see solar projects without storage. Now, the energy storage projects are moving forward even independent of solar projects, and so in areas in Virginia, for instance, we were out permitting a project, and right behind us was a developer that was pitching a energy storage only project. And so the more penetration that we're seeing with renewables, the importance of increasing the amount of renewables on the grid, we're going to need a corresponding increase in energy storage. So the prevailing kind of process that most developers are headed down is lithium ion being kind of the leading technology in the space. We've seen other long duration storage projects popping up, one in northwestern Minnesota and eastern North Dakota is a really interesting one with Otter Tail Power. And so we're starting to see kind of a diversification of the types of storage that are needed. Obviously, these heat events and wildfires that are happening in the Northwest are accelerating deployment in some of those areas. We're going to see on the community scale side, I think, a recognition that bill credit rates are going to be tied to a time of day use. And so we're seeing in California, obviously, that market is driven by time of day energy pricing, even down to the residential meter. And so for community solar, the price signals that will likely happen is that you're going to get a larger bill credit or a higher bill credit if you're offsetting power between the hours of, say, 2 and 4 p.m. or 2 and 7 p.m. and effectively allowing developers to interject energy storage to address deployment of that energy during those peak periods. And so that further aligns us with the utility. I think it addresses a few different things that will start to make sense. And this is already the case in some pilot programs in places like Hawaii. So I think it's obviously coming. We recognize it. For those of your listeners that are familiar kind of with the duck curve, in areas with high solar penetration during the, you've got a peak really that happens much later in the day, and you've got a valley during the high solar hours of the day. And so essentially trying to shift that to a later time is going to be the goal of both regulators, the utilities, and then ultimately via price signals with developers and project owners.
Got it. And maybe a couple follow-ups on other questions that sort of tie into the storage topic. Investor asking, I think you mentioned in your comments that in 5 years, storage will be attached to most, if not all, solar projects. What are the attachment rates now? Are you doing storage attachments now to some of your projects, or is it sort of coming in the future? This is one part of the question. Maybe let's do that one first, and I'll do the second part.
Yeah, on commercial projects, it's still rare for us unless we're in areas with where the market signals are, where it's very apparent that storage is benefiting the projects. And so what I mean by that is typically where, an energy bill is divided between capacity and energy. And so in areas where the capacity or demand rates exceed a certain dollar amount, typically $15 or more, then we can start to see a benefit to adding storage to the project. And in one case, we've got a project in a utility that has $30 per kilowatt demand. The storage is actually decreasing the payback for that customer by 2 years. So it's very lucrative in some of those situations. Policy really is lagged behind with energy storage, and so some states are just now kind of getting pilot programs rolling out where the market and utilities are already saying, hey, this makes sense today. Let's skip the studies, let's skip the pilot programs and go straight to implementation. So the market's leading a lot faster than policy. So it's just going to take a few years to catch up. I know that with the most recent infrastructure discussions, the bipartisan proposal, which we've all heard about over the last couple of weeks, does not include provisions for clean energy. However, if a budget reconciliation bill does move forward, and I think in all proposals there's standalone energy storage tax credit, and that's also going to help to increase the deployment. Where today you can only receive tax credit on coupled projects, solar and storage. We're going to start to see more just energy storage alone projects moving forward, and some of that legislation obviously will help to accelerate that.
Yeah, storage is what we need. There's tax credits with the ITC and the PTC for wind. While they're blunt instruments, they're quite effective. Right? It is definitely helped get both the solar and wind industry sort of up to scale in the United States. It'd be interesting, and from what I've heard, pretty bipartisan support for something similar for storage. So maybe just tying into that, and I'll tie in two separate questions, but two separate people asking about software. And so one related to how important software if you're coupling with storage, because obviously once you have storage, then there's decisions to be made. Should the electricity be going to the grid or to feed the battery, discharge the battery? How important is software there? And then someone else was asking about how important is software in terms of controlling the tracking system.
Both are very important. I think we've seen. I'll talk to the tracking first, and then the storage. So we've seen companies like Nextracker, who I believe is kind of preparing an IPO. We've seen ATI that went public earlier this year with, kind of an astounding evaluation. I can't remember off the top of my head, but really kind of forcing a lot of folks in the industry to think, is going public right now the thing to do, which I believe the answer is likely yes. But Nextracker, who's a competitor to ATI, has really led the way, and Dan Sugar is the kind of the CEO over there, kind of a luminary, and also just a big public figure in the solar community. Pioneered, this idea that when you're looking at the topographical maps, you're looking at the production of these systems, there's ways in which you can design the array both from a physical standpoint as well as from a software standpoint to maximize the production of these systems. And so, their claim is that just via software they're able to eke out several percentage points more in production, which is critical in many cases, especially in these large systems. So the software really has taken off there, and I know that some of the competitors have caught on to that and making sure that that their software offerings are up to speed with Nextracker. On the flip side of that, with energy storage, it's even more important because we're not talking about tweaking a tracker by 3 degrees in a certain part of the day. We're talking about instantaneous microseconds of give and ebb and flow of these devices, and so we are starting to see kind of leaders in that space developing the software and also the modeling for developers too. And so we use a product called Energy Toolbase, which takes in the 15-minute data from our commercial customers. 15-minute data for the entire year, breaks it down, and then interjects modeling of how much. What if we had 200 kilowatts of solar and 200 kilowatts of battery storage, and then it can help us optimize the size of system that makes the most sense in terms of economics and other attributes. And so, if you had to do that, by hand or in any other way, it'd be impossible. And so the software has really kind of led over the last few years in the energy storage space and is absolutely critical in making sure that these systems are fully optimized and economic for our clients.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. And maybe one more question. We sort of covered a bit of the policy with the and your comments on the Biden infrastructure bill and where some of the tax credits are. One specific participant was asking, you mentioned some states, I think it was Massachusetts, Wisconsin, I'm going to forget the last one, maybe it's New York, that sort of have pretty supportive community scale solar programs right now. Investor asking any states they should keep an eye on for potential changes upcoming in the next year or two?
Yeah. So most recently this year, New Mexico implemented it or passed their community solar legislation, which had taken several years. And that's what we're kind of seeing on the policy front, is that once a bill is introduced or once this policy is introduced, it really takes a couple of sessions for it to kind of build momentum, get the right co-sponsors, and then come to a compromise with the utilities and other stakeholders. And so Pennsylvania is the next one that's kind of up. It's been through the ringer a few sessions in a row. there's a lot of optimism for that state because it's one of the largest energy using states in the country, and so that's one to keep an eye out for. I mentioned Michigan also in that category, Wisconsin, Delaware, and some western states, including California. And once if California implements a program, which right now they just have community aggregation, that is likely to be the biggest market, or could be the biggest market in the country. So I would say near term, Pennsylvania, kind of midterm, maybe Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, and some of these other markets.
Perfect. And with that, we only have about a minute and a half left. Eric, before I hand it back over to you for any sort of closing comments, just a quick thank you to all the participants who emailed questions. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Julie, the operator, for helping us out here today. This is our last call in June in the UBS Energy Transition Call Series. We'll have some more calls in July. And then, typical since 2018, we've been running this. We typically take August off of the call series, but don't worry, we will keep it up and running back in September, and I appreciate all the clients and participants for supporting the call series. It really does make a difference in our ability to keep doing it. And then lastly, and most importantly, Eric, thank you for taking your time out of your day today. I think you're the exact type of speaker, I think, when we started this call series that we were looking to have on, people that are actually on the front lines, actually doing this work to talk about the issues, right, in a very sort of honest and forthright way. So, Eric, really, really enjoyed the conversation today. I'll turn it over to you for any closing comments.
Thank you so much, John. It's been my pleasure to be here and talk with you all today. I've been very fortunate to be on this journey here over the last 14 years. And the one way that I've been paying it forward, is to leave the door open for others to come in behind me. We're seeing that the clean energy revolution is going to need 5 million new workers in the next decade. And so I wrote this book called Clean Wave, A Guide to Success for the Green Recovery, cleanwavebook.com, where folks, if you've got a nephew, if you're interested, go check it out. And then also, just again, allowing me to be a part of this conversation on behalf of Impact Power Solutions. IPS-solar.com is our website. And again, we help corporates across the country implement on-site and off-site solar projects. So thanks again to you, John, and UBS for hosting.